I don't know about you, but I can identify with the writer of Isaiah who says, "Oh God, that you would come down and tear open the heavens." Wouldn't it be great if God would come down and do some really big stuff? Shake up some mountains, light some brushwood on fire, make water boil, make the nations tremble, kind of do the whole awesome God thing. Because heaven knows the world is a mess. The natural disasters like flood and drought and earthquake are bad enough. But the human-made disasters, climate change, economic global collapse, poverty, homelessness, unemployment, I could go on and on. I would like for God to come down and just do what God said he was going to do in Isaiah and make it right. Now, that whole thing about my righteousness being like a filthy cloth, that could be a little bit uncomfortable. I know I'm not perfect. I'm not that bad, though, really. I mean, I'm not as bad as some people I know. My righteousness could probably use a little bit of cleaning up, yeah, but maybe more like a sweaty t-shirt than a filthy cloth. I mean, after all, I try really hard. I work hard for this church. I try and do things for my family. I just hosted Thanksgiving dinner for 18 people, and I had to write a sermon and everything. And now I have like Advent and Christmas stuff to get ready for, and I don't know how I'm going to get it all done. So what would be really great for me is if God would let me know in advance when this whole heaven-tearing thing is going to happen, because I would totally show up. I am interested in what God is doing. And in fact, this Thursday afternoon is pretty good for me. So if that works for God, I would completely clear out my schedule so that I could see what God is doing. Completely. I hope you know that I was speaking tongue-in-cheek. I would like to say that I have never actually wanted God to fit into my schedule. But the truth is, sometimes that's something that I have longed for. It would make it a lot easier for me to plan ahead if I knew what God was going to do, instead of waiting for those awesome deeds that we don't expect, like it says in Isaiah 64:3. I have a hunch that the Jews of Jesus' time were also getting kind of impatient. After all, they had been waiting for 1,500 years since Isaiah wrote. Our New Testament reading kicks off at the beginning of Mark chapter 13, when Jesus tells his disciples that the temple of Jerusalem, which took 120 years to build, is going to be destroyed. This is an enormous and almost unimaginable tragedy. And the disciples pull Jesus aside and say, "Hey, could you tell us when that's going to happen?" And Jesus gives a long and not very encouraging answer about what a mess the world is going to be. And that answer ends with the words that Dina read for us this morning. About that day or hour, no one knows. Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake. So, there you have it. No simple, obvious timetable that fits into my busy schedule. Jesus has the nerve to tell us to stay alert and keep awake. In church, no less. So, in the spirit of staying alert and keeping awake, I'm going to administer an awareness test. Should be painless, takes less than a minute. It's something that either adults or children can do. I'm going to have the media center dim the lights, and I'll show you a short video awareness test. Now let me tell you in advance, this test is going to ask you to count the number of times that something happens. Don't count out loud. That will ruin the test for the people around you. Okay, are you ready?
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
As you might have guessed, the purpose of that awareness test was not to see how well you can track the ball being thrown, but to illustrate that we often see what we're looking for and miss the things that we're not looking for. More than half of the people who see this video for the first time miss the moonwalking bear. How many of you saw the moonwalking bear the first time through? Very good. About 3 or 4 of you. Once you've watched the whole video, it's almost impossible not to see it. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say our life in the world is a little bit like that. We may be acutely aware of the ways our lives in the world is a mess. We can count the injustices, large and small. A nasty word from a coworker, a slight from someone at church, families asking for money for Christmas presents, people with job skills and willingness to work who are still unemployed, entire countries whose economies are on the point of collapse. I don't deny that these things are real, but they're not the only realities in our world. If we focus on only these realities, we can completely miss or completely discount what God is doing in the world. In her book, An Altar in the World, Barbara Brown Taylor writes, "Most of my visions of the divine have happened while I was busy doing something else. I did nothing to make them happen. My only part is to decide how I will respond, since there's plenty I can do to make them go away. Namely, number 1, I can figure I've had too much caffeine again. Number 2, I can remind myself that these visions are not true in the same way taxes in the evening news are true. Or number 3, I can return to my attention to the things that I need to get done every day. These are only a few things that I can do to talk myself out of living in the house of God." Or, she continues, "I can stop what I'm doing long enough to see where I am, who I am there with, and what God is doing in that place. I can flag one more gate to heaven, one more patch of ordinary earth with ladder marks on it, where divine traffic is heavy when I notice it, and even when I do not." To live with an awareness of God in the world, or Emmanuel, God with us, is to live in tension with our present realities. The presence of God does not mean that the injustice in the world magically goes away or that it ceases to matter. God's presence shows us another way of living and being in the face of that injustice. It gives us hope that things can be different because we know that God wants things to be different. God's will is that all people are treated fairly, that everyone has enough food and shelter for themselves and their families, and that no one hoards more than they need so that other people are hungry or homeless. Maybe God could accomplish these things by tearing open the heavens and coming down. Or maybe God has another plan, one which involves us. When faced with injustice or someone else's need, we tend to have two responses. And these are the same whether the problem is one on a personal scale, like the emotional struggle of a child or a spouse, or on a global scale, like world hunger. One response is to take all of the pain into ourselves, to become overwhelmed by the enormity of the need and paralyzed by our inability to solve the problem. The second response is to detach ourselves and say, in effect, this isn't my problem. You'll have to deal with it yourself. Both of these responses are understandable, and they have something in common. Neither one of them actually solves the problem. Taking all of the pain on ourselves might make us miserable, but our misery doesn't solve the problem. Holding the pain at arm's length keeps us emotionally uninvolved, but that doesn't address the problem either. You can think of both of these responses like breathing. The first response is like taking in a big breath of air and trying to hold it all in our lungs, not letting it out. The second response is like trying to constantly exhale to push that pain and that suffering away from us. As you know, breathing is only effective if you take air in and you let it out. That pattern of engagement and release is what we need in order to work for God's justice in the world. Pastor Janet and I have both been inspired by Sister Bridget Hassey, a nun who has collected her stories in the book Generous Faith. One spring night, when she was working in Appalachia, Sister Bridget saw a PBS television special on the 1985 famine in Sudan. There was an image of a starving child that she could not get out of her mind for days afterward. Within 3 months, Sister Bridget had requested and been granted a transfer to a camp in Sudan, home to 12,000 starving Sudanese and Ethiopians. Nothing could have prepared her for what she saw. Hundreds of tents sprawled across a dry, barren desert, human waste everywhere, children sitting in the dust, mothers with shriveled breasts trying to nurse their infants. Sister Bridget writes, "The enormity of the situation overwhelmed me, and a debilitating depression rendered me immobile. For 2 days, I lay collapsed on the poles and rope we relief workers called a bed, mentally plotting how I could return home. I had responded by coming, but found that I could not endure staying." When a camp doctor finally came into the tent, Sister Bridget asked, "How have you done this for so long?" And the doctor answered, "I carefully feed the child who is in front of me, and I don't think of the hundreds who are still hungry." And the doctor quoted Mother Teresa of Calcutta, "One-on-one is how it's done." The challenge is to release our anxiety about the hundreds of people that we can't feed so that we can be attentive to the people who are in front of us, to the people whom God places in our path. Sister Bridget writes, "One can be tempted to stop feeding the starving, to look upon intense deprivation, starvation, and suffering as ordinary. I prayed for the inward grace to keep compassion alive, the fires of tender care burning, and the passion within me to alleviate the suffering of children. Were it not for an update from the Church of the Brethren last week before Thanksgiving, I don't know how aware I would have been of the suffering in Somalia. Nearly 3 in 10 children are acutely malnourished, and people are dying daily of starvation. More than 13 million people across Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya are without enough food because of a severe drought. I may not be called to serve in a camp in Somalia, but being part of the Church of the Brethren, I can help through the Global Food Crisis Fund or the Emergency Disaster Fund, or I can write my congressman about the need for humanitarian assistance. I can pray for hungry people in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere, and I can remember to be thankful for the food that I have, even when it's yet another round of leftover turkey and dressing. I believe that hope is the perseverance to practice compassion in the face of suffering and injustice. Hope is created when our present realities compel us to work towards God's justice in the world. Hope may appear as small acts of courage practiced daily, rather than a huge event that tears open the heavens. But hope is still God's work, even when God chooses to work through us. After all, God's greatest act of hope for the world came through a Jewish peasant girl who had the courage to say yes, even though pregnancy for an unwed woman of her time meant shame and possibly death. During this season of Advent, we remember that God brought hope to the world not by tearing open the heavens and installing a Messiah in a blaze of glory, but by lifting the hem of heaven just enough to allow the birth of a baby, a little bit of heaven made flesh and sent to dwell among us. Through his healing, teaching, and witness to power, Jesus showed us that one-on-one is how it's done. In the coming week, I invite you to pay attention to signs of hope in the world. Pay attention to what you pay attention to and where God might be calling you to act in the world. I'd like to leave you with a poem by Marge Percy called The Art of Blessing the Day. Here's the final stanza. Attention is love, what we must give children, mothers, fathers, pets, our friends, the news, the woes of others. What we want to change, we curse, and then pick up a tool. Bless whatever you can with eyes and hands and tongue. If you can't bless it, get ready to make it new. Amen.